Okay, sorry. So it's 8:07. I'll call the meeting to order. Um, Apologies that I'm remote, and I think the town is transitioning from having folks helping us with these meetings to to sort of letting us do them on our own, which is great. But I had the same login that you did, meaning just a link, and so no, like I guess they're gonna have to figure out how they sort of assign someone um, to actually be the host. So we've got
Thank you.
some.
I
I
was
think.
looking for the Zoom. I don't see the Zoom code. Do you?
Well,
This is
it's
all
go
I've
to
got. It's the
meeting.
phone.
It's go. Yeah, that's fine, Barbara. It's go to meeting, so it's a different app because I
Okay.
don't know why, but it's just inevitable. It's always going to be a different meeting one than what you have available. But I think we're going to be using go to meeting
Okay.
whenever it's the town's setup.
Okay.
Okay. So
Okay.
if
Yeah.
you
Okay.
want to put yourself
I'm
on mute until you've got questions.
I'm
And
okay. I just want to be. I want to be present.
okay,
Right.
you're present. We've got you. Um, so,
I will.
but, but
I'll just shut up and behave. Right. Okay.
okay. So we've got some folks joining us from the HHR committee and Jennifer Charnesky, if I pronounce that right, who had spoken
Awesome.
at the finance and budget meeting, and Jack had suggested we invite her to join us as well. So before we get into running through the agenda, including the minutes and these resolutions, and just in the interest of her time, I thought we'd let her speak first, and she could kind of give us a bit of um,
Good
probably very
idea.
similar, probably very similar presentation to what she had given to finance and budget. Jennifer?
Thank you. Ed, were you able to share that pro forma with your committee? If I reference it, will they know what I'm talking about?
I don't know. I meant to. I've sent them many things. I tend to send things as soon as they come in. Um,
Okay,
why don't
no
we
problem.
assume I didn't do what I was supposed to do, and so they don't have it, but they definitely have some materials because Jack had sent me some things and I forwarded those.
Okay.
Yeah, Ed, it would have been Jen's presentation would have been in the same email I sent you with the slide deck for the HHR presentation. So if you
Yes, okay, then I sent it.
if you
Okay,
forwarded all of it as a
Yep.
bundle,
Yep.
Jen's would have gone.
Okay, so for everyone, I'm going to be referring to this. This is a pro forma prepared by our financial advisor who assists with our bonding. Anytime we do a big project like this and we're seeking an approval, we make some assumptions about when we would bond, how much we would bond, in order to just get a sense for what the debt service impact would be of the appropriation. On page 3 of that document, you can see that we are showing debt service for 20 years. So the expectation at this point, the assumption is that we would issue for 20 years and that we would issue the total amount for the project over 3 different bond issues. First one being in July of 2023, and then each year thereafter. Right now, we're assuming they're going to be pretty even amounts, but what we actually borrow and when will be based on what the cash flow of the projects turns out to be. So we'll be in contact with the HHR committee, looking at what they're spending. So this is really all an estimate just to give us an idea. If you look at the total proposed debt service column on page 3, it starts out low debt service as we're ramping up the project. But by 2027, we're at our full principal and interest, and it totals about $6.4 million. Based on our current grant list, that would be 0.7 mils in terms of budget and property tax. But what I also want to point out is the next column where we see our combined debt service, it's our existing debt plus HHR. We're at 10 million in fiscal 22, And we'll be paying some of that down as this new HHR debt is coming on. So in 2027, our total debt will be about $13.7 million. So even though we're going to be having about $6 million of debt service for HHR, we'll be paying down some other debt in the years 2022 or 2023, I guess we're almost into, and forward until we really have the full HHR debt on our books. When it comes time to actually issue the bonds, the Board of Finance will have a discussion about how they want to structure the bonds. They will have a better sense of what the interest rate is. Right now, we have some assumptions just based on current market conditions and expected increases in rates, but we'll have a better sense for actual rates at the time that we're going to issue. And then they will also make a decision on how we structure the debt in terms of if we pay level principal, if we make it level debt service, if they defer any principal. So there's a lot of levers that they can pull to try to keep our total debt service as flat as possible. That's kind of the summary of it. In that pro forma, there's also a nice chart on page 4 where you can see our existing debt, and then as we add on the 3 borrowings for HHR, what it does to our total debt, and then how it declines in the out years. With debt, we always have more that we add on after we pay some off, so it ends up staying pretty level. But this is our debt profile as of right now with what we have on the books plus the full HHR amount.
Okay. Can I ask? I'm going to ask this question. I don't mean it to be sound like a dumb question, but would it be fair to say that in thinking about like why this project or these 3 projects now for this much money, is there kind of a, well, we're comfortable carrying this much principal and interest. We've been paying off our bonds. So when you look at the forecast here, we can sort of quote unquote afford it. Is that part of the logic? If we weren't, and I guess I'm kind of asking, like, if we weren't doing these particular projects, would we be sitting around saying, well, we should be doing something else? Maybe we'd be knocking one school to
So that is part of the Board of Finance's consideration when they approve any appropriation and authorization for bonding. They do look at this exact same information and say, what's it going to do to our total debt? What's it going to do to our annual debt service? How much of an increase? And then there's some other metrics in the back of that pro forma debt as a percent of the total budget that they focus in on and say, is this manageable? I would use the word manageable rather than affordable.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And they have already approved these. They've made the determination that this is a manageable amount of debt for the town. If we weren't doing these projects, we would have a decrease in the budget, assuming nothing else filled in their place. Over time, we'd have a decrease in the budget because we would have continued pay down of our principal of what's already outstanding, but then there's always a need that comes up, a renovation for the schools or something on the town side, where we end up borrowing because it makes sense to pay it over a long term rather than in just one budget year.
Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, so I appreciate these comments. Jen, I want to preface my comments or my questions just saying that I'm very excited about these projects. I think it's wonderful. I think this town having portable education classrooms, it's all going to be done. And I'm very impressed by the people on this call, David, Jill, and Chris and you, Jen, and others. I've listened to these presentations you gave to Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and also I think the other day to Gia Davis's committee, which was very helpful. But here's really what we're talking about, right there. Regarding financing, we're not asking for 75 million of appropriation. We're asking for 75 million appropriation over the next 3 years, right? I know you are saying 6.4 million that is going to cost, right? Which is, you say 0.7 million, right? Which translates into 4%, right? So it's really 4% annual increase, right? As you said, if we didn't have to do it, our debts would, our interest would be 6% lower, right? 6 million lower. But here's where the thing, we know your assumption is 5%, 4.9% on these bonds, right? 5.15% on this bond in 2025. You want us to give permission now to these, and I understand why, right? We're doing all three together because we get some grants later on, or part of it's going to be paid back, and there's some efficiency of scale, but clearly increases the risk, right? You don't have to come back. What if interest rates go to 10%? Suddenly 6 million goes to 12 million. Right, what about 15%? 1981, we had 15% interest rates. I don't know where the rate's going to be in 2 and I'm not in 2 years. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do these projects. I'm just saying, let's make sure we know what we're giving you permission to do, which is issue 75 million of debt, not at these rates, but a year from now, 2 years from now, and 3 years from now. And just to sort of quickly go, and there's a question I'm going to get to, but let me just quickly go through the debt, right? I'm looking at the presentation that we had at the board of, at the state of town presentation, right? We started at 100 million debt in 2012. We were, in 2020, we were at 60 million. Now with Oxbridge, we're at 80 million. So this basically goes from 60 to 135. We're doubling it. And this is before this project that we want to buy Great Island. I know that's what we're discussing today, but we're increasing the debt burden, clearly, right? So here's really the question. The question is there any way to hedge these interest rate costs? Can we, like when you buy a house, right, you have a 120-day lock. I know this is 3 year, right? But I just don't know the muni market. Is there any way to pay something now and issue later? Because this cost could double easily.
So when it comes time, when we're going to issue, we are bound by certain requirements for issuing tax-exempt bonds. One of those requirements is that we have to issue within 18 months of when the first expenditure occurs or when the asset is put into service. So that is one way. If rates are 10% in July of 2023, one complication is if we're spending $77 million, or say we spent 1/3 of this so far, we're going to need cash. But we would look at, if rates were sky high, we might say, let's issue bond anticipation notes because those are typically a lower interest rate, especially if we think in the future we're going to see rates come down. So we may issue bond anticipation notes. We can issue I think up to 3 rounds, 1 year at a time. So we could extend that for 3 years before we permanently finance, and that might give time for rates to come down. Alternatively, if it looks like rates are as low as they're going to be, and for the foreseeable future, we will borrow as much as we can, but we are also, on the expenditure side, we have milestones where we have to spend certain percentages of the amount that we borrow within a certain time frame. And by 24 months, we have to have it all expended or committed. So it's not, we can't borrow it all at once and hang on to it, and we can't necessarily hold off until rates are good. But it is something that we would look at and try to structure based on what are the current market conditions, what are current rates, what are they expected to do in the future? Do we need to issue more because we think they're going to go up? Do we want to try to draw it out with bond anticipation notes because we think that rates are going to drop? So we have some flexibility in that, but we can't do kind of whatever we want. But we would play around with that and try to get the lowest borrowing cost for the town. The other thing is when we do issue, we usually have a call option at 6 or 7 years. So if we were forced to issue at a high rate, when that call option comes around, if rates are lower, we have the opportunity to refund bonds at the lower rate. So that's another protection if we have to issue at a very high rate and then rates change.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. You meant, these schools should be open by fall 2025, so most of the course will be done by then, right?
Right.
So the earliest, given these rules that you just mentioned, the earliest we can issue it, just to minimize the time, right? To take care of the risk, is You said 18 months before we fund it, so it would be
18 months after the first expenditure or after the asset is put into service. But then there's still some caveat that it can't be any longer than 3 years. There's some timing requirements. But the other complication is that we don't have $77 million in the bank to pay for all of this while we wait for rates to come down in order to borrow. So we would look for how can we get the best rate that's available at the time. And would it make sense to do bond anticipation notes for a couple of years if rates are really high? It would be evaluated at the time that we need to go out and issue, whether because of timing or because of cash needs. It would be evaluated of what's the best option at this time.
You'll be evaluated, but we're giving you the right to issue it today, right?
Right. Right. If this gets approved, technically we could go out and issue all of it, but then HHR would have to spend it really fast. You know, so that certainly wouldn't happen, but that is technically what approval of these resolutions is giving.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else with questions? Clara?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know that the question is for Jennifer. I know we approved preliminary expenses for this project, you know, several months ago. I was pretty shocked by the cost for renovations. I think this is more money than was spent to build Darien High School. I just would like it if we could, just in the interest of seeing that taxpayer money is spent responsibly, could we have a little bit of a review of why the renovations were considered a better option than building a new school in one of these situations? I mean, we have seen that, you know, two of the schools from the 1996 renovations, I'm sorry, were had to be completely rebuilt. And I would hate to think that 10 years from now, somebody's going to say, why didn't they rebuild Holmes or Royal, one of those? So I know there's been, you know, a lot of presentations about different aspects of this, but is there any chance that we can have a little bit of review of why it's better to do these renovations than it is to build perhaps one school, one very big school?
Chris?
I didn't hear that. I'm sorry. What was the very last part of that? Why it's better to do renovations than?
Why is it more cost effective to do these 3 renovations rather than perhaps build one very big school and, you know, fewer, you know, and maybe stop using one of the schools?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was going to be obviously part of our presentation. It was part of the presentation that we did to each of Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance. I don't know if you'd gotten a chance to see any of those. But a big part of it is, well, from a cost effectiveness standpoint, you know, Ox Ridge is a $65 million-ish plus or minus project for a new out of the ground school, right? So leaving aside whether or not you could take a school out of service and combine schools, I don't know that much thought had been given to that at all. If you were to build, you know, just by way of round numbers, right? I mean, you could spend 65 plus or minus $1 million times 3 to tear these down and rebuild, or you know, roughly 25 or $26 million per school to renovate. And I think the decision to renovate is, you know, partly based on the fact that these schools were in considerably better shape. The base buildings, the bones of these schools were in considerably better shape than Ox Ridge or Tokenique when they were reviewed. And it was decided that we could renovate these schools, expand classrooms, new libraries, upgrade systems, and have very, very high functioning, up to standard schools that, you know, should have at least the useful life as the last renovation, right? I think there was a sense that the 96 renovation could have been done better. I wasn't here. I wasn't living in town then. I wasn't involved in that renovation, but from those who were, that there were issues with some of those renovations. I think the hope that we'll get at least 25 years, hopefully, considerably more than 25 years of additional useful life out of these renovations. But I think ultimately it came down to the fact that these facilities, these campuses have been very, very well maintained. They were well built when they were originally built. And the people who studied the existing conditions in 2016 and then did the conceptual plans in 2021, and then ultimately the Board of Education concluded that the basic platforms were sufficient to renovate rather than rebuild all the way up. And and ultimately it's more cost effective. So for $77 million, you get 3 updated elementary schools for what would cost, essentially what it would cost to build up, one brand new one.
And is the
I would
is the capacity of the schools the same as it is now, or will it be that it could handle a higher enrollment?
Yeah,
Ed,
the schools.
yeah,
Go ahead.
I'm going to suggest we go into our presentation because we're starting to get into the meat of it, and it might be easier to go through it in order because we do have a lot of us in there.
Yeah, and we did. Yeah, we covered a lot of that in the last 3 times we presented this, but I'm happy to do it again.
Yeah, and Chris, I'm sorry. I do appreciate you have presented this to other in other forums, but not everyone on this meeting's probably
Right.
seen those. Could I just
Right.
ask if there's anyone else that has questions for Jennifer, so that if not, she's free to drop and do other personal things. So is there a lot of people with that are videos off, so I won't see your hand. So please unmute and speak up.
I would just like to comment that the one thing to consider is the loyalty of the parents in each of these elementary school districts and their happy support of their local school. So these kind of renovations are really important to the neighborhood and to the neighborhoods. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
That is true, Barbara. And when we go through the presentation, we'll get to a slide which has a lot of statistics on the schools. And you'll notice that these 3 campuses are only 8 acres. The Oxford School has a 10-acre campus. So we know this about Darien. We don't have a lot of open space for really large buildings. So, that is just another factor. And again, you'll notice it as Chris goes through the slides.
Thank you.
Okay, Chris, I don't know if you have a way, can you share your presentation on the screen, or is that not an option?
Yeah, I think Jill and I and Sarah have been communicating on that, and I believe that you can invite Jill to share the slide deck. I don't think you need either or make her the host, one way or the other.
Shoot. I do not know what button. I mean, I'm on an iPad, so I don't have my buttons seem to be limited.
I'm on a telephone. I'm sorry. I can't see anything either.
Can't do it, Barbara. You definitely can't do it.
Sorry. No, I'll take a step back. I'll shut up. Take a step back.
Yeah, I'm Chris. Sorry. I mean, I think it'd been someone from the town that was. Oh, there we go. Great, wonderful.
Boom.
Yeah, let me just press slide deck.
There you go. Thank you, Jill, very much. So anyway, for those of you who don't know me, haven't met me, weren't at the last time we presented, my name is Chris Price. I'm the chair of the Hinley Holmes and Royal Building Committee. I am joined by my colleagues on the committee, David Martin, Jill McCammon, and Sarah Newman. They also happen to be, in David's case, a member of the Board of Finance, in Sarah's case, a member of the Board of Selectmen, and in Jill's case, a member of the Board of Education. And so they liaise with those boards on a regular basis as well. The presentation that we're going to go through this evening is really to talk a little bit about what the charge to the building committee is, and what we think, what that really translates to. Talk a little bit about some aspects of it that cover the three schools in common generally, then talk a little bit about each of the schools specifically, and then and hopefully try to answer a lot of that will address some of the questions that Clara brought up, which were very pertinent questions, and then talk about the appropriation process, the state grant process, kind of where we are in the timeline of the project, so that way, and then ultimately go through the calculations of how we came up with the estimated amounts for the appropriations for each of the three schools. We'll reiterate this as we get a little deeper into the presentation, but one thing to keep in mind is these are, and we're being careful to treat these as three separate projects with three separate appropriations, so that when we presented them to Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and the Finance and Budget Committee of the RTM, they were all brought forward as three separate projects. So going back to the building committee charge, this was approved in May of 2021, end of May, almost a year ago exactly. The key language in the building committee charge from the Board of Selectmen was that a building committee was being formed to renovate in accordance with specific education specifications that the Board of Education approved, to renovate the three schools. Next slide. What does that really mean when you look at the ed specs? The ed specs are 20-ish pages plus or minus for each of the schools that the Board of Education adopted. Boiled down to a PowerPoint slide, it really focuses on eliminating the portable classrooms, renovating or replacing the libraries renovating the library in one of the schools, replacing the libraries in two of the schools, creating what are being called global learning commons, then right-sizing some of the classrooms, both some of the general learning and the special classrooms, and then updating a number of outdated systems, primarily mechanical, electric, HVAC, and building envelope systems. But it would also, as we get a little deeper into the presentation, you'll see, also considering a fair amount of work on the sites of a couple of the schools. One of the things you'll see, one of the themes, thanks, Joe, we'll get to that slide in just a second. One of the themes you'll see is a lot of the work that's being done here is going to be effectively invisible. It's going to be behind the walls, right? It's going to be in the basements. There's going to be a lot that's going to be done to make the schools nicer and airier and more pleasant environments for the students. But an awful lot of this work is going to be upgrading systems, which are in some cases antiquated, in some cases are original from when these schools were first built in the 30s and 40s. Next slide, please. So this is, bless you, Clara. This is your, this is one of your questions that we have on our slides that we have in the deck. And this is, the next bunch of slides, as I noted, are going to be slides that cover more generally the project as a whole, rather than each of the individual schools. We'll pivot to the individual schools in a bit. But the good news is, as I noted just a bit earlier, due to the quality of these buildings, due to their age, due to how they were built, it was determined to be more cost effective to do a renovation than to replace these buildings. And a big part of that is really a credit to Mike Lynch and the school district and his team for how well they have maintained these facilities since they were last renovated in 1996. It would also allow us to optimize the existing sites. As Jill noted, these sites on these three schools are a little bit tighter than the Ox Ridge site. Gives a little bit less flexibility for, for pure expansion. And ultimately, as I noted, I think a determination was made that we can get the children and the staff and the teachers in these schools to a very, very high quality environment for on a more cost effective basis by doing these renovations rather than building new. Obviously an issue that we have to consider, and I know people think about this, is kind of the equity between the different schools, right? I mean, the kids at Ox Ridge are going to get a brand new shiny school, and Tokenique got a new school in 2007, I believe it was. The kids in Holmes, Hinley, and Royal should have comparable facilities to go to school, and that's the goal. But look, a big part of this is the portables. The portables are past their useful life. They're obsolete. They've been renovated. Most people think there's really not much left to the portables. I also think a goal is to bring the kids all into the building. I think ultimately people think that will be safer. Next slide, please. Libraries. As noted, the plan is to renovate the Holmes Library and replace the Royal and the Hinley libraries. Hinley and Royal's libraries were built in the 70s and are past their useful life. Holmes Library, while newer, needs to have a classroom relocated, needs to be renovated, needs to create some separation between the library and the gym. From what I'm told, it's pretty hard to use that library when kids are playing sports in the adjoining gymnasium. And a big part of this is the way libraries are being used has changed. The libraries, Jill and I were lucky enough to tour a couple of newly renovated and in some cases newly built schools that the architect candidates that we interviewed had worked on recently. And you walk into these big, bright, flexible learning spaces where you have kids with their teachers collaborating in groups. It's not just stacks of books and tables. They really become integral parts of the whole learning environment in the school. There's a lot of technology in the libraries. There's a lot of spaces for collaboration and research. And they're flexible. They can be moved around. The furniture moves around, the stacks move around, etc. In addition to the libraries, we're evaluating and we'll be right-sizing a number of the classrooms, which is the next slide. Some of the classrooms in some of the schools are actually smaller than state standards, so we need to expand them and bring them up to size. They may not fit, in some cases, the full class size. We want to optimize the way some of the classrooms are designed so that the way the teachers are teaching, it's not, when I went to elementary school 100 years ago, classrooms were rows of desks with a teacher in front. Now what you see is learning pods, flexible furniture, kids sitting in different places, annexes to the classroom out in the halls, things like that. And the way the kids learn and the way the teachers teach, the classroom should be adapted to that. Also, as noted, we want to have the classrooms in these three schools be consistent with what we have in the rest of the district, and to be the right sizes for the different grades. Obviously, a fifth grader needs a little more room than a kindergartner. They're just bigger. And then to Clara's point on enrollment, the ed specs reflect, and the design that we're going to be working on reflects the fact that we're going to be building to meet the high end of an 8-year projection of enrollment. Basically, based on what we know now about projected building in town, projections have been made of sort of low, medium, and high of enrollment. And what the state wants us to do as part of our approval and grant process is to project at the high end. And that's what the ed specs reflect. So the projects that we're going to be undertaking are being designed to the high end of those enrollment numbers. I think just for a data point, that high point is, the folks who project these things out, they're looking at that as though the high points occurring in the school year 2030, 2031. Next slide, please. As noted, the systems are a big part of this. It's a lot of it's, like I said, going to be behind the scenes. It's not going to really be visible. People will say that, you can greater than 50% of the total project budget here, I think, is going to be what people call MEP, which is mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. It's going to be systems, HVAC. It's going to be improving the electrical load because of the amount of technology that kids are using these days, adding additional outlets so kids can plug their laptops in, converting the rest of the schools to LED lighting, which will be more energy efficient and cooler, generating less heat, replacing and converting boilers, putting in air conditioning throughout the schools so that these 3 schools are up to par with the other elementary schools and have air conditioning. And then while we're not planning to install solar, it's not part of the budget, it's not part of the ed specs. We are going to have the roofs of these schools designed to accommodate solar if it's decided ultimately down the road that is the plan. The upgrades to the systems should result in operating efficiencies, so it should be ultimately, hopefully, cheaper to operate these schools. But this is a very much of a modernization program. As we get into the individual schools, you'll see, there are some of the schools that have portions of their heating systems are steam from the 30s and the 40s that, Mike Lynch and the school district team have kept running, and they keep the schools nice and warm in the winter. But in the warm months, it makes it difficult. We really do need air conditioning. I heard a story that Bridgeport the other day, when we had our first 90+ degree day, closed some of their schools because it was too hot and they weren't air conditioned. We want to avoid that. Plus, it gives the school district and the town more flexibility to use these facilities, right? They can use them for sports, for example, and other things in the warmer months. Shifting to the next slide, please. So here's where we really shift to talking about each of the individual schools and what's being done at each of the individual schools. And maybe now would be a good time before we do that. I'll just pause now and see if there are any questions on what we've gone through to this point. Peter?
So I think, yeah, I mean,
Oh,
I'm
I'm sorry,
looking at
Ed.
your screen, not looking at any people. So anyone who has questions should just take themselves off mute and shout out.
Yeah, I think Peter put his hand up, so I'll call on Peter first.
Yeah, so one area systems, I want to make sure that it's addressed, and I appreciate it may not be addressed here in a public forum, but somewhere in executive session, maybe with the Darien Police Department, construction managers, architects, and that's the safety security of the buildings. We all expect as taxpayers and parents that these buildings will be as secure as any in this country. And safety and security not only after, obviously, when it's done, but also during the process. It's going to be tricky. I appreciate that. There are a lot of people moving around, but let's make sure, please, that it's number one priority on everybody's radar. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a great point, and thank you for raising it. And it was a really, really important point that we asked the architectural candidates to address, and it's in the ed specs and the construction. There's as you noted, there's security covers a lot of different things, right? Obviously, there's safety and security of the students in school, to avoid tragic incidents like have happened recently. And then there's the construction process, right? And all of the construction managers that we're interviewing, we talked extensively about how do you achieve complete separation between the work that's going on and the people that are doing the work and the students and the teachers that are trying to, conduct their school day. Because, I guess maybe I didn't say it, but these projects are intended to go on during the school year while the kids are in school, while we may need to move kids around in the buildings, and conceivably, although this is still very much TBD, move kids to other schools where there might be space. We have to keep the contractors and the kids completely separated, and that's a high priority item that we've been discussing with each of the candidates to be the construction managers. How do they propose to do that? How do they enter and leave the site? Where do they keep their cars? How do they make sure that there's no risk to the children, either encountering workers or, dealing with noise, vibration, dust, etc. So,
Chris, just a
Jill?
point of clarification, that there probably will be some work that goes on during the school year, but part of why we've structured the timing the way we have is that we are planning to take full advantage of the two summer period, summer of 23, and then so starting the summer of 23. So,
Absolutely.
One more quick question, if I can.
Yeah.
Somebody else wants to. Yeah. So you mentioned solar, and I don't want to divert discussion only to solar, but these projects will last for us 25 years, right? That's what we're thinking about. Yet there is no solar, no geothermal, and I understand we're preparing it for it, and I understand. I think you mentioned in other presentations that it's really town and the state taking charge on the solar. I get that, but have you talked to them? Are we going to do it? This is a perfect opportunity to do that, right? And taxpayer doesn't care whether it's right hand, left hand, right? We need to deliver school that's going to be there. And I know Mr. Palin from the Board of Finance mentioned that he heard somewhere that maybe even fossil fuels should be phased out by year 2040 in public buildings. I don't know if that's true or not, but what would you comment on this?
Yeah, so on the solar front, there are state programs, and those are being explored directly by the town. And if it makes sense to do it, I assume the town will coordinate that. There are grants that are made available by the state. And like I said, the buildings are being designed to accommodate that if that's a route that they decide to go.
Peter, this is David Martin. One of the architects mentioned geothermal in particular as a possibility, but they provided estimates that geothermal would add somewhere between $1.5 and $2 million in cost per school. And that there are limitations on geothermal in terms of it has to be used a certain way, a certain number of days to keep the system in balance, both throughout the summer and in the winter. And it's not clear that all the programming is sufficient to maintain it that way.
It also depends on the geology of each of the school properties, right? And individual schools may not be able to utilize it.
that said, it is on our list of things we're looking at. You'll note later we indicate we don't have a full HVAC strategy. So, there are some significant obstacles to geothermal, but we're not ignoring it.
Thank you.
As you plan for this, considering Peter's questions about security, you don't have to answer this, but would you consider requesting a school resource officer type person for the three schools that are having the construction going on, because I think that it would be an important presence, particularly because you have so many people on the site who sort of don't belong there normally. It might be a good idea to consider that just as an extra presence of somebody who will be looking out for the students and kind of keeping that separation going, and being aware that, you know, there are people who might come into the site who don't belong there. Just a suggestion. You don't have to answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I understood, and you know, there are a lot of town departments that we're going to be liaising with. One of which obviously is the police department, and we'll have that conversation with the general contractors in the police department as to whether that's appropriate. And I think you know, the board of education obviously will
Right.
have input on that, as well as will the school district. If no one else has a question on what we've been through so far, I was going to shift gears and talk about each of the individual schools a little bit. So on Hinley, the scope of the project at Hinley, you know, as noted, and you'll see this is a common theme: demolish the portables, demolish the existing library, build a brand new library, and expand and build a number of new classrooms. Also renovate a number of the spaces where those functions are being moved to Ox Ridge. In particular, the developmental learning system that's going to be centered in Ox Ridge, that's going to free up some space at Hinley that can be repurposed. We're going to upgrade the infrastructure. And I do want to note something, Jill, I just want to digress. Jill made a really, really good point, which is we don't know exactly the scope of what we're going to do with the HVAC. A big part of what the architect and the general contractor and the MEP engineer are going to do is a really, really deep dive study into what's there, what can still be used, what has to be replaced, and then how it actually goes about designing what's going to be put in. You know, is it going to be on the roofs? Is it going to be in the basement? Things like that. But you know, the goal ultimately is to upgrade the systems, the mechanical, the electrical, plumbing, and the technology systems to, you know, to state of the art for these facilities. And then in the category of things we're still looking at and that are possibilities and sort of fall under the column of to be determined, a possible extension of the bus loop, an entry and an exit onto Route 1 for Hinley, and that's going to involve the State Department of Transportation, for example. So there's a lot of constituencies that will have input there. Possibly additional parking, and Hinley has a stormwater drainage system that runs through the campus, and so a fair amount of time is going to be spent studying and addressing how that system either needs to be moved, how it can be improved. Are there alternative ways to deal with stormwater? And that will be, again, that's we know that the neighbors around Hinley are very, very focused on that. And that is something that will be addressed as part of the overall design of that school. And that's going to be done in conjunction with, like I noted, a number of other departments within the town, such as P&Z and Public Works. Over on the right hand of the slide, you see some comparisons between, you know, the current conditions at Hinley and what the plan is post renovation. Next slide is Holmes. Again, common theme. I'm sorry. Did somebody have a question? No. Holmes, common theme: demolish the portables, add classrooms. As I noted, the library at Holmes can remain as part of the structure, but it will be renovated and improved. Again, upgrading the infrastructure, the MEP, the technology, the electricity, the lighting, and studying some potential expansions of parking, making sure the bus loops are as efficient as possible, looking into whether the adjoining property that that the town owns, that is called the Curtis property, can be integrated into the Holmes campus and made part of the Holmes campus.
All
That's going
right.
to hinge. That's going to hinge largely on the land surveys that we're having done that are in process as to whether or not the Curtis property is usable based on elevations, is it wetlands, grade, soil conditions, things like that. Again, sort of pre and post, before and after stats on the right side of the slide. Next slide is the Royal project. Common theme, demolish the portables. In the case of Royal, as with Hinley, demolish and replace the library, add classrooms, expand classrooms that are below state specs, as I noted at the beginning of the presentation, and also repurpose some of the program spaces that are being moved to Ox Ridge. Again, upgrading the infrastructure and studying a possible expansion and reconfiguring of the bus loop and the parking. Next slide, please. So in terms of overall time frame, as Peter noted earlier, the plan is to have this done, working backwards. The plan is to have this done for the beginning of school in late August 2025. Our committee was formed earlier this winter in February of 2022. We expect to spend a lot of time over the course of the last part of this spring and into the summer, working our way through design, review and approval by the various town departments such as planning and zoning and the building department. We have an architect that's been retained. I can talk about that in a second. We're hoping to have a construction manager retained in the next week or so. They will be working together, collaborating very, very closely on design, on what's called pre-construction phase, on bidding, with a goal to being able to start construction basically at the end of the school year next year. Not an exaggeration to think, students and teachers leave the buildings in June of 2023, contractors move in and go to work. And as Jill noted, the summers and holiday periods are critical times and will be a big part of the phasing. As noted, while they are 3 separate projects, all 3 projects should be going on at the same time. A lot of work is going to be done during the school year, so we are going to be working around students and teachers. There's going to be an awful lot of thought given to, details like contractors not showing up when the parents are dropping the kids off, right? I mean, a lot of that level of detail is already, are already big topics, right? Not having equipment moving around while school buses and parents are bringing the kids to school and picking the kids up from school. Next slide, please. Pivoting again to the state grant process, and ultimately, to what we're going to ask this committee to approve, which is the increased appropriations. I'm going to turn a lot of this over to Dave Martin in a second, but so people understand, and you can kind of put a pin in it, June 30 is a key date. By June 30, we have to have submitted our appropriation for the 3 projects to the state, called the OSCGNR, which is the state body that reviews and approves school renovation and construction projects, and will decide how much to propose to the governor in terms of portion of our project that they're going to reimburse for. You get one shot at it. If you don't get it in by June 30th, you're waiting a year until next June to get in the next cycle, because you go in June 30th with your submission. OSC GNR works closely with you and your contractors and your architects and your grant consultants to revise and refine the grant submission so that it can go to the governor in December of 2022, which is then wrapped into the statewide education bill in the spring of 2023, so that there's a final grant commitment by the summer of 2023 and funds start to become available to us to start to pay our contractors. The key thing is that you need to go to the state with the full amount of your appropriation. Now, in a perfect world, we would do that after we had full design drawings and we had the contracts all bid out, and we knew with a fairly high degree of precision and confidence what this was going to cost. Unfortunately, that's unfortunately not the way the process works. It's not the way the process worked in Ox Ridge. So we have to come up with our requested full amount of the appropriation based on the information we have, which is basically conceptual drawings and a lot of very, very educated estimation work done by our grant consultant, by our architect, by Dave Martin, by Mike Lynch, to come up with what these appropriation estimates are. And you basically have to go to the state and say, here's how much Darien is willing to appropriate, assuming the state gives you nothing, right? So Darien's willing to pay for the whole thing. Here's how much we've appropriated. Now state, you go and tell us how much, what percentage you're going to give us by way of reimbursement. So that's kind of where we are, right? That's where we are in the process right now. Next slide, please. Obviously a key piece of this is managing the numbers, right? Cost control is going to be important. We are going to do our absolute best to balance the goal to get the absolute best projects, the best facilities, but the most bang for our buck. We're going to try very, very hard not to value engineer these things down to where we regret not spending money on certain things, but we're not going to spend money haphazardly. Our contractors and our architects are going to use a very, very robust bidding process. We're down to 2 primary candidates to be the construction managers. Both of them are absolute top-notch firms who have done an awful lot of K through 12 school construction and renovation, and who will very, very closely oversee the bidding process. We're going to use a lot of the processes that Ox Ridge, that their committee has used to try to manage costs. We're going to be reporting on a regular basis to all the respective constituencies, whether that's Board of Finance, the town administrators, et cetera, on a regular basis, so that we reconcile what we're spending against the budgets. And we're relying, ultimately we're relying on a very, very, very professional team of third parties, primarily the architect and the construction managers. Next slide, please. And this is the but slide, and there's always but, right? There's this is the caveat, which is, as I said, these are renovations. In some respects, while new projects may ultimately cost more money, there's a certain simplicity to it. You build a brand new school, you tear down the old school. We're going to be marrying old and new here. We know what the scope is. We're still very much at the early stages. As I noted, the HVAC studies are not really completed yet. The land surveys are still in process. The euphemism is, you don't really know how complicated it's going to be until you start tearing the walls down. And so, we think we have a very good educated sense of what this is going to cost and how long it's going to take. And that's very much because we're leaning on people who have done this an awful lot with a lot of experience including the Ox Ridge Committee, and folks on the Ox Ridge Committee that were heavily involved in, for example, the renovation of the middle school, which was a project where there was a situation of marrying old and new. 60% of the middle school was existing. Only 40% of it was brand new. So that's like I said, that's the caveat slide, that these are renovations and there could be some unknowns that are uncovered. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn this over, as I said, to Dave. This really will go through the process of how we arrived at the amounts that we're requesting, and tell you a little bit about sort of how we got there, how the numbers were arrived at, who the parties were that were involved in putting this together. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave, as I said.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to reiterate Chris's comments that the estimates that we have are rough. They're based on the preliminary conceptual drawings. The designs are going to change between now and probably end of the year, maybe early beginning of the year. And the cost estimates will obviously be modified all along the way. And these estimates that we're going to go over, as Chris mentioned, specifically do not include any reimbursement from the state. But we can get into that in a little more detail later. As Chris said, we received estimates from all three architects and from O&G, which is our consultant for the state grant process. And then I worked with Mike Lynch and Jen Charneski separately so that we could develop the soft cost components for the town side. I will say that I compared the data that we got from the architects with the data that the Ox Ridge Committee got from the architects, and the cost estimates that we received from the architects was not nearly as detailed as what the Ox Ridge Committee received. There were significant variations between the architects in terms of what the contingency rates were that they applied to the different contingencies in the project. There were differences in what the escalation rates were that they used, and they classified some of the costs differently, with some of the costs being classified as soft costs and some of the costs being classified as construction costs, depending on which architect we got the estimates from. Ultimately, we felt most comfortable with the estimates that we got from O&G, our consultant. Hopefully you all received those estimates as part of the package. If not, let me know. I can forward them to you subsequently. But they're pretty thoroughly detailed for estimates that are done on preliminary drawings. And we felt most comfortable with O&G for 4 reasons. One was that their estimates were the most detailed by far of the estimates that we got. 2 is that O&G maintains its own database of costs that are based on projects that they have either bid or been involved in, so it most closely reflects actual recent cost history. And O&G's estimate was derived independent of the architect's estimates. Their estimators did not have access to the architect's estimates when they were coming up with their own estimates. And lastly, O&G has its own professional staff of estimators that all they do are estimates for projects like this. So just a quick example of how our project compares to the Ox Ridge project. If you look in the project in the details, The design contingency in our project is slightly higher than what was in Ox Ridge. It's coming in at 10%, where Ox Ridge was at 8%. And I think that's reasonable, given that there are 3 separate schools here. There are going to be 3 separate designs, and there are things that are going to come up as they get into the process where the designs may need to be altered depending on what they determine with the existing conditions in the facilities. The biggest single change from the Ox Ridge project, and should be no surprise to anybody given the inflation environment that we have, is that the escalation number for the costs embedded in the project is 8% for our projects, and it was 4.5% for the Ox Ridge project. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to the other presentations, the way that the escalation works is the escalation is 8% per annum up until we have bids from the contractors, accepted bids from the subcontractors. Because when the subcontractors submit their bid, they typically include their own escalation in their estimate. So that effectively locks in the escalation at that point. The other items, the construction manager's contingency and the owner's contingency, are the same in our project as in Ox Ridge. So that brings us to the reimbursement potential. The state has a reimbursement rate that is fixed for these types of projects, renovations. That rate is 20.71%, but it will get adjusted for 2 primary factors. One is they have a square footage formula that they apply to the schools. And based on preliminary estimates, 2 of our schools are going to be impacted by that, so that the reimbursement rate will be lowered by the square footage calculation. The other one is what is deemed to be eligible versus ineligible by the state. It's not really possible for us to make any reasonable forecasts on that at this time, given that our designs are still preliminary. And that they're going to evolve over time. Last thing I will say is that the reimbursement for each school is likely to be different, and that's based on the changes to the rate that occur from the square footage calculations and what's deemed to be eligible or not eligible. And we should be able to have a number that is a reasonable approximation, later in the process. When we get some of the costs a little more pinned down. So I'm pretty sure that everyone got included in the package a spreadsheet that shows a total cost summary chart. I can't share it on the screen, but I can just sort of show it to you if that works. It looks something like this, and what it shows is by school, the estimates that we got from each of the architects, the estimate that we got from O&G, and where we came out with our best estimates. And in the far right-hand column, you can see the column is labeled HHRBC. That's Hinley Holmes Royal Building Committee. And where we ended up was for Hinley, our best estimate cost is $25.76 million. For Holmes was $23.6 million, and for Royal was $27.39 million, for a grand total of $76.75 million. And then for purposes of the resolutions, we slightly rounded those up to the next most even number. So in the resolutions that you all will vote on and hopefully approve tonight, the Hinley resolution is $26 million even. The Holmes resolution is $24 million even, and the Royal resolution is $27.5 million even, for a total of $77.5 million. I think some of you may have seen the initial estimates that we had were slightly higher than that. There was a math issue with the estimates where the sum of the subcomponents did not match out to the subtotal in one particular area. So when we got that corrected, that resulted in a reduction in the cost of $2.25 million. But the numbers that I gave you that total to $77.5 million are the numbers that we are using for tonight.
If you note the last line on that slide, the numbers that Dave came up with include the 3.7 preliminary appropriation. So technically speaking, these are revised appropriations, not new appropriations. They're just their increases over what was approved back in April.
Thanks, Chris. I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, nope. So I guess again, stopping there, because we're about to turn this back over to you all to discuss and hopefully vote on, and as Dave said, hopefully approve these requests. But before that, we obviously want to address any further questions that members of the committee might have. Peter.
So to me, other than the financing risk that we discussed earlier, which is reasonably, large, but there's some mitigants that Jim described to me. To me, the biggest risk here, listening to you gentlemen, is that we're doing 3 projects concurrently. And I appreciate on one hand that the charge was given as such, so it's really a question for Board of Education possibly. And I appreciate the equity that parents would feel or need to feel, the economies of scale possible, and also the state grant process. All makes sense. But just what I was jotting down here, your comments of we're marrying new and old, we're rebuilding renovation. There's a lot of uncertain when you start tearing stuff down. There's a cascading effect. Estimates are not as detailed as for Oxford. Significant unknown given the speed of work. So these are real risks, right? And now we will have KG&D, who is the chosen architect, and the construction manager in 3 schools where we could have a problem. So I guess the mitigant that I was looking for in the question for you is, and I know you did a lot of work to choose the architect, and I'm sure you're doing a lot of work, choosing the construction manager. You described some of the diligence that you have done, but have these guys, KG&D and the construction manager, one of the 2 firms we'll choose, have they done concurrent projects in the same towns? Do they have enough capacities to do them? Have we seen them? Are we comfortable with it? I mean, I'm just looking for some mitigants before we get there, so we don't, we're not surprised here in the middle of 2024. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think as part of the process for selecting the architect and the process for selecting the CM, again, kind of a high priority item. We talked about phasing and working around the students. Another high priority item is bandwidth and the ability to run and supervise 3 concurrent projects, right? And do they have the people to do that? And ultimately, that's going to really fall on the construction manager, right? Because when it really gets going, it's going to be the construction manager, and the construction managers each presented to us that they're going to have 3 fully staffed parallel teams. Each of the schools, there'll be, in effect, a single project manager, and then there will be at each of the schools on each of the campuses a senior level, what they call project superintendent, which will be the person reporting up to the even more senior project manager overseeing the job on each of the schools. And a big part of the requirement is that they've done multiple concurrent projects, and checking references and things like that. I think we're as comfortable as we can get. based on the information we have, that the folks we're talking to are capable of doing that.
Perfect, thank you.
I mean, and I think candidly, we sort of are, you know, you raise a really good point, Peter, which is the way the state process works is you would, you know, literally need to do one a year if you were going to try to do it sequentially, right? It becomes incredibly inefficient. So, the idea being to do it all at once.
Yeah, I've got
Ed?
I've got a question, and I don't really know, Chris. It's definitely not a question for you, and I guess this is maybe more for Dave in his capacity of Board of Finance. But I think, you know, look, something that people are wondering, and it's not really, it's not, you know, it's not on the agenda, but you know, we're talking about this project. This is in front of us, okay? But the front page of the Darien Times talks about another project that has nothing to do with, let's say, education, but does have to do with sort of spending a bunch of money. And given that the money all comes from the same group, which is the taxpayers, you know, I guess that's just probably something that, like, a lot of folks are wondering about. How will the affordability of this project look if our debt profile is different? And that may not really be something to address because, like I said, it's not in front of us, but it's certainly something that people are wondering.
And I can speak to that just briefly now, since the other details of the other project are not yet out. You know, can't really talk to it too much, but the approvals are happening sequentially, right? So assuming that you all approve this and the RTM approves it in June, this project will be approved and in the pipeline at the amounts that we would be approving currently. And when the Board of Finance goes to consider that next project that you're referencing, the consideration for the next project will include the impact of the debt and the debt service from this project. So it's really the next project that will be at risk, if you will, given that this one has already been approved in advance of that next one.
Thank you.
Would agree, and I would just add to that, you know, we've been talking about these projects since 2016, and so there's not really, you know, I certainly think a lot of due diligence has to go into the next purchase, but there's nothing unconsidered or unnecessary about what we're up in front of you saying today. This is, you know, this is work that needs to be done on the buildings, and it's been talked about for quite some time. So I respect the difficulty of the decision making at this time, but I feel very strongly that this needs to move forward.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Understood. Does anyone else have any questions? And again, I'm not. I only see the screen, so I don't. If you want to say something, either just jump right in. Okay, so whoever has control of the meeting, can you give it back to me?
Happily.
Oops, sorry, I'll take just a second. I haven't done it before, but I'm trying. Sorry.
That's all right. I just can't. We got to vote, and it's hard to do the votes if I can't see the Hollywood squares.
I know. Sarah, jump in if you know how to get me out of this. To unshare.
I don't. Hang on one second. I'm looking it up. Sorry, guys.
You know what? I'll just pop out of the meeting and I'll come back, and that way you can move forward.
Good plan.
Okay. So if nobody else has any other questions or comments, we'll move on with the agenda that's in front of you. First item of business is the approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Could I get a motion to approve the minutes? Carolina, and a second? Anne, okay. All in favor, please either raise your hands or say aye.
Aye.
Okay, looks unanimous. And nays? Abstentions? Okay, looks unanimous. Moving to the next item, sorry, and I'm just gonna look it up so I read it correctly. Recommending item 2215, appropriation and bond authorization for the Hinley renovation in the amount of $26 million. Could I get a motion to approve that? Carolina, second. Clara, all in favor, please raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye, okay. Any opposed? Abstentions? No, okay, that is unanimous. The next item, 2216, appropriation and bond authorization for the Holmes renovation for $24 million. Could I get a motion for that? Anne, and a second. Carolina, all in favor, please raise your hands or say aye.
Aye.
Aye, okay. Any opposed? Abstentions? No, okay, that is unanimous. And then finally, item 2217, appropriation and bond authorization for Royal renovation for $27.5 million. Can I get a motion? Clara, second. Carolina, all in favor, please raise your hands or say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Okay, that is also unanimous. There is no other business because this is a special meeting. We have to stick to our agenda. David, Jill, and Chris, thank you very much for joining us. Your presentation was very helpful. I will be using it for the notes that we put together for our next meeting. And if anybody has particular points that they would like me to make when we present this at the RTM meeting, please email me separately. With that, could I have a motion to adjourn? Anne, second. Carolina, all in favor, please say aye or raise your hands.
Aye.
I think that's unanimous. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Yeah,
Thank you,
before
Ed.
everybody leaves,
Thanks, Ed.
thank you.
Oh, yes.
Just before everybody clicks off, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the thoughtful questions. Appreciate the patience as we went through the slides. This is a complicated project, and really welcome your participation and thank you. So we will, I guess, see you all at RTM on June 6th. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.